March 1936. Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The snow had turned to gray slush on the sidewalks, but inside the back room of a cramped barber shop on 135th Street, the air hung thick with cigar smoke and something far more dangerous, fear. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to every soul north of 110th Street as Bumpy, sat alone at a wooden table. Before him lay a single photograph. 12 faces, 12 soldiers, 12 killers sent by the most powerful man in American organized crime. Lucky Luciano had made his decision. Harlem would bend, or Harlem would bleed. What happened in the next 48 hours would either establish Bumpy Johnson as the uncontested emperor of black organized crime in America, or leave his body in an unmarked grave beneath the frozen earth of Potter's Field. This is the story they never told you. To understand why 12 of Luciano's most lethal enforcers crossed into Harlem that March, you must first understand what Harlem meant in 1936. This wasn't merely geography. This was an empire. The numbers racket alone generated over $20 million annually, the equivalent of $350 million in today's currency. Policy slips exchanged hands in every barbershop, beauty parlor, and candy store from Sugar Hill to the Polo Grounds. Working men and women who could barely afford bread would bet their last pennies on a 3-digit dream. And for decades, that money had stayed black. Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madame Queen, had built this kingdom through intellect, intimidation, and an ironclad refusal to share power with downtown's Italian syndicates. She had survived Dutch Schultz's invasion. She had outlasted his enforcers, his bribes, and his bullets. When Schultz himself was gunned down in a Newark chop house in October 1935, Madame St. Clair reportedly sent a telegram to his deathbed, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." But Dutch Schultz had been a lone predator. What came next was a system. Lucky Luciano had reorganized the American underworld into something unprecedented, the Commission. 5 families in New York alone, with tentacles stretching to Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and beyond. When Schultz fell, his Harlem territory didn't vanish. It became available, and Luciano wanted it. He sent word through intermediaries. The message was elegant in its simplicity. Harlem's operators would now pay tribute to the Genovese family, 40% of all policy proceeds. Non-negotiable. Madame St. Clair refused. But what Luciano's messengers didn't know, what nobody downtown understood yet, was that Harlem had found its protector. His name was Bumpy Johnson, and he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Ellsworth Johnson arrived in Harlem in 1919, a 14-year-old boy from Charleston, South Carolina, carrying nothing but a battered suitcase and a reputation for violence that had already forced his family to send him north. The nickname Bumpy came from a pronounced knot at the back of his skull, the result, some said, of a childhood injury. Others whispered it was simply the physical manifestation of his stubbornness, his refusal to bend to any man's will. By 20, he had established himself in the policy trade. By 25, he had survived 3 separate attempts on his life, 1 by knife, 2 by gunfire. Each time he walked away. Each time his attackers did not. But what distinguished Bumpy Johnson from every other Harlem gangster was not his capacity for violence. It was his mind. He read voraciously, philosophy, history, economics. He studied the tactics of military commanders and political strategists with the same intensity that downtown mobsters studied race results. He understood something that would take his rivals years to comprehend. Survival in the underworld required more than muscle. It required systems. By 1935, Bumpy had become Madame St. Clair's primary enforcer and strategic advisor. When the commission turned its gaze toward Harlem, it was Bumpy who organized the resistance. But then everything changed. In February 1936, 3 of Madame St. Clair's most trusted lieutenants were found in an alley behind the Apollo Theater. Their throats had been cut. A note pinned to the chest of the middle corpse contained 2 words, "Last warning." Luciano was done negotiating. What followed was a month of calculated escalation. Policy runners were beaten on street corners in broad daylight. 2 collection points were firebombed. A respected Harlem banker who laundered numbers money was found floating in the Harlem River, his fingers removed with precision that suggested professional interrogation. The message was unmistakable: submit or suffer. And then, on March 14, 1936, Bumpy Johnson received word from a contact inside the Genovese organization. The information was brief but devastating. 12 men, experienced killers, veterans of the Italian-American War. They had arrived in Manhattan the previous night. Their orders were explicit: eliminate Harlem's leadership in a single coordinated strike. Bumpy Johnson, Madame St. Clair, every major policy banker north of Central Park. The attack would come within 72 hours. What Bumpy did next defied every expectation. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't call for reinforcements or attempt to match Luciano's firepower. Instead, he sent invitations. March 15, 1936, the morning after the warning, 12 sealed envelopes were delivered by hand to 12 different locations across Manhattan: hotels, boarding houses, a social club in Little Italy. Each envelope contained the same contents: a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery, a single photograph, and a Harlem address. The note read, "I know who you are. I know why you're here. Before you proceed, consider what I know about you." Each photograph showed something different. For one recipient, it was an image of his mother's apartment building in East Harlem. For another, a picture of his brother's bakery in Brooklyn. For a third, a photograph of a woman, his mistress, entering a building the man had never mentioned to his wife. Intelligence. Bumpy Johnson had spent years building an intelligence network that rivaled anything the Italian syndicates possessed. Porters, doormen, chambermaids, shoeshine boys. The invisible army of black workers who moved through every corner of New York, seeing everything, reporting to a man who understood the value of information over ammunition. But the envelopes were only the first move. The address in each envelope led to a single location: a warehouse on 142nd Street, just west of Lenox Avenue. And the note specified a time: 10 o'clock that evening. What happened next would become legend. Not all 12 men came. 7 ignored the summons, dismissing it as a bluff. But 5 of Luciano's gunmen, perhaps curious, perhaps rattled, perhaps believing their numbers gave them advantage, arrived at the warehouse that night. They never emerged. By midnight, the remaining 7 had received new photographs. These showed their 5 colleagues, alive, seated in wooden chairs, their faces illuminated by harsh electric light. Each man wore an expression of unmistakable terror. The accompanying note contained a single sentence: "I'm prepared to discuss terms." 3 things happened in the next 12 hours that would reshape organized crime's relationship with Harlem for the next 3 decades. First, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Bumpy Johnson made a telephone call to a private residence in the Bronx. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. The recipient was Vito Genovese, Luciano's underboss and the architect of the Harlem campaign. No recording of that conversation exists. But we know this: Genovese's response was immediate. He sent word to his remaining 7 soldiers in Manhattan to stand down and await further instructions. Second, at dawn, a meeting was arranged through intermediaries. Bumpy Johnson would meet with a representative of the commission, not Luciano himself, but a figure authorized to negotiate on behalf of the Italian families. And third, most remarkably, the 5 captured gunmen were released. They were not harmed. They were not threatened. They were simply released, driven to the outskirts of Harlem in a panel truck and deposited on a street corner in the early morning light, uninjured but profoundly shaken. What happened inside that warehouse remains unknown to this day. The 5 men never spoke of it publicly, but their silence communicated something that violence never could. Bumpy Johnson was not a man to be conquered. He was a man to be reckoned with. The 48 hours had expired, and every gunman Luciano sent to Harlem had effectively vanished, not into graves but into irrelevance. March 17, 1936, 4:47 p.m. The Hotel Theresa, 7th Avenue and 125th Street. The Waldorf of Harlem stands 13 stories tall, its white brick facade dominating the intersection like a monument to black prosperity. Inside, the lobby buzzes with activity. Bellhops in pressed uniforms, businessmen in tailored suits, women in furs despite the warming weather. But the 7th floor is silent. Room 714 has been cleared. The furniture has been removed except for a single round table and 4 chairs. 2 windows overlook 7th Avenue, their curtains drawn against the late afternoon sun. The only light comes from a single brass lamp positioned in the corner. At precisely 4:50, 2 men enter through the service stairs. The first is stocky, Mediterranean features, wearing a charcoal overcoat and a fedora pulled low. His name is Anthony Carfano, known as Little Oggi Pisano, a Genovese family captain with authority to speak for the commission. The second man remains by the door. His hand never leaves the inside of his coat. Carfano removes his hat. He studies the empty room, and then he waits. At 5 o'clock exactly, the main door opens. Bumpy Johnson enters alone. He wears a 3-piece suit of charcoal gray, hand-tailored by a 7th Avenue craftsman. His shoes gleam. His posture communicates neither aggression nor submission, simply presence. He is 31 years old, but his eyes carry the weight of a man who has survived more than most will experience in a lifetime. He walks to the table, he sits. Carfano remains standing. For 7 seconds, an eternity in the grammar of power, neither man speaks. Then Bumpy Johnson gestures to the empty chair across from him. "Sit," he says. It is not a request. Carfano's bodyguard takes a step forward. Carfano raises a hand, stopping him. Slowly, deliberately, the Italian captain removes his overcoat, drapes it over the back of the chair, and sits. "You've caused considerable trouble," Carfano says. "I've responded to considerable provocation," Bumpy replies. 5 of our men spent 9 hours wondering if they would live to see morning. And now they know they will. That's more certainty than your people offered my associates in that alley behind the Apollo. Carfano leans back. His expression shifts, just slightly, from irritation to something approaching respect. "Mr. Luciano has reconsidered the terms of our proposed arrangement." Bumpy does not respond. He waits. "Harlem's operations will remain independent, no tribute, no interference. In exchange, Bumpy interrupts, we establish a relationship of mutual benefit. Your people need distribution networks for commodities that move more efficiently through black neighborhoods. Numbers, policy, certain pharmaceuticals. We provide those networks. You provide protection from federal interference, the kind of political insulation your people have cultivated in Albany and Washington." Carfano's eyes narrow. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking it through since the day Dutch Schultz first sent his collectors across 110th Street. Your organization is a system. Systems require partners, not subjects." I'm offering partnership. And if Mr. Luciano prefers the original arrangement, Bumpy Johnson reaches into his jacket pocket. Carfano's bodyguard draws his weapon halfway before Bumpy produces a single sheet of paper, folded twice. He slides it across the table. That is a list. Names, addresses, known associates. 17 members of the Genovese family currently operating in violation of federal narcotic statutes. Evidence sufficient for conviction. Currently held in 3 separate locations. Copies ready for delivery to the United States Attorney should anything unfortunate befall myself or my associates. Carfano unfolds the paper. Reads. His face drains of color. This is, how did you? Mr. Carfano, every porter in this city, every maid, every elevator operator and shoeshine boy, they are invisible to you, but they see everything, they hear everything. And they tell me. The silence stretches for nearly a minute. Finally, Carfano refolds the paper. He does not return it. I believe Mr. Luciano will find your proposal acceptable. He stands. He retrieves his coat. At the door, he pauses. This arrangement, how long do you envision it lasting? Bumpy Johnson permits himself the faintest smile. As long as it remains mutually beneficial, which, if we're both intelligent men, should be indefinitely. Carfano nods once. Then he is gone. This is the moment that everything changed. Within 72 hours, word had spread through every corridor of organized crime in America. Bumpy Johnson had faced down the commission. Bumpy Johnson had captured Luciano's soldiers and returned them, as a gesture of calculated mercy that demonstrated power far more effectively than bloodshed ever could. And Bumpy Johnson had secured something unprecedented. Harlem's independence, guaranteed by the very organization that had sought to conquer it. The alliance that emerged from that meeting in room 714 would endure for nearly 3 decades. The Italian families provided political protection, police corruption, and legal representation. Harlem's operators provided distribution networks, community insulation, and intelligence that downtown syndicates could never replicate. It was imperfect. It was frequently tested, and it remained always a relationship between unequal partners, but it was sustainable. And in an underworld defined by violence and short lives, sustainability was the rarest achievement of all. The question that haunts students of this history is deceptively simple. Why? Why did Luciano accept these terms? Why didn't the commission simply send 20 soldiers instead of 12? Why didn't they wage the kind of protracted war that had crushed opposition in every other territory they claimed? The answer reveals something essential about both men. Lucky Luciano was, above all else, a businessman. He had reorganized the American underworld not through romantic notions of honor or vendetta, but through cold calculations of profit and loss. A war in Harlem would be expensive. It would attract federal attention. It would disrupt existing operations across New York. And most critically, it would be fought on terrain where his soldiers were visible and their enemies were invisible. Bumpy Johnson understood this calculus better than anyone. He understood that his greatest weapon was not the pistol beneath his coat or the loyalty of his men. It was the environment itself. Every block of Harlem was territory he knew and Luciano didn't. Every resident was a potential informant, a potential obstruction, a potential witness who would see nothing when police came asking questions. This was asymmetric warfare decades before military strategists coined the term. Bumpy Johnson had studied history. He had read about guerrilla campaigns, about resistance movements, about small forces defeating larger ones through superior intelligence and strategic patience. And he applied those lessons with surgical precision. But perhaps the most remarkable element of Bumpy Johnson's legacy is not what he did in those 48 hours. It is what he refused to do. He refused to kill when killing would have been justified. He refused to torture when torture would have yielded faster results. He refused to wage the kind of brutal retaliation that would have satisfied his followers' desire for revenge. Instead, he demonstrated something far more sophisticated: restraint as power. By returning those 5 soldiers unharmed, he communicated a message that resonated through decades of organized crime history. He was not a man consumed by violence. He was a man who controlled violence, who deployed it strategically, who preferred intelligence over ammunition. That restraint earned him something that fear alone could never provide: respect. The Harlem arrangement persisted until 1968, when Bumpy Johnson collapsed on a street corner in Harlem at the age of 62, his heart finally surrendering to decades of stress and conflict. By then, the world had changed around him. The civil rights movement had transformed Black America. Narcotics had devastated communities he had once protected. A new generation of gangsters had emerged, men who lacked his strategic patience, his intellectual rigor, his fundamental understanding that crime and community were inseparable. But for 32 years, Bumpy Johnson had accomplished something no one believed possible. He had carved out autonomous space within the most ruthless organized crime structure in American history. He had negotiated as an equal with men who considered equality an impossibility. He had protected, imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely, a community that had few other protectors. This is one of 30 untold stories about the men who shaped American organized crime, not through brute violence alone, but through intelligence, strategy, and the kind of psychological sophistication that history has too often ignored. The next story reveals how Frank Costello survived 7 assassination attempts through a single innovation that transformed how power operated in the American underworld. That video explores the architecture of protection and what happens when even the most careful system fails. But for now, consider this. In 48 hours, Bumpy Johnson made 12 gunmen vanish, not through violence but through vision. He understood something that his enemies never grasped. Power, true power, doesn't come from the capacity to destroy. It comes from the choice not to. It comes from demonstrating control so absolute that destruction becomes unnecessary. Lucky Luciano controlled the largest criminal empire in American history. He commanded thousands of soldiers, millions of dollars, political connections reaching to the highest levels of government. But in March of 1936, he met a man from Harlem who controlled something more fundamental. Luciano controlled an organization. Bumpy Johnson controlled information. And information, in the end, controls everything.